There is a strange beauty to be found in the silk-smooth darkness of a story well told. Step into our world of shadows and light, where every secret is a thread in a much larger tapestry. Subscribe now and help us unravel the mystery together.
People talk about silence like it's an absence. They're wrong. After my husband passed, silence became a presence. Thick, weighted, filling every corner of our house on Wentworth Street like furniture I hadn't chosen and couldn't return. 7 months of it. Long enough that I'd stopped being surprised by it. Long enough that I'd learned the particular ache of making coffee for one person and still filling the pot for two. Hugh had been the kind of man who hummed while he cooked. Not real songs, just sounds. Little melodic nothing sounds that traveled from the kitchen to wherever I was in the house and told me, without words, I'm here. All is well. I hadn't realized how much I'd organized my whole sense of peace around that sound until it stopped. Grief, I've learned, isn't the big moments. It's the hum you keep listening for. The shop was what kept me going. 63 years old, widowed in November, and running a pie shop in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. That was my life now. Technically, it had always been my life. Hugh and I built it together over 31 years, but now it was mine alone in a way that still felt strange, like a shoe that fits but pinches in a place it never used to. We'd named it Honeycomb Pies. Honey from the word, comfort from the concept. It had a yellow awning and a hand-painted sign that Hugh did himself the summer we opened. He wasn't an artist, but he'd been determined, and determination has a look about it that I always found beautiful. My brother called on a Tuesday evening in late June. I was sitting on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a library book I wasn't really reading. The fireflies were just starting to come up from the grass. "Sis," Doyle said, and I could tell from the first syllable that something was coming. I'd known my brother for 61 years. I knew his voices. This one was the voice he used when he'd already made a decision and was calling to inform me of it rather than consult me. "What is it, Doyle?" "Glenda and I have been talking." He always paused after the wife's name, as if it added authority to whatever followed. "We're worried about you. The shop, the taxes, the Church Street property Hugh left in the estate. That's a lot for one woman to manage alone. I've managed the shop for 31 years. With Hugh," he said gently, like that was a kindness rather than a needle under the skin. "We want to come down, help you get organized. Sit down with someone, legally, I mean, just to make sure everything's protected." I agreed because he was my brother, and because saying no to Doyle had always felt like holding a door shut against the wind. You could do it, but it cost you something. They arrived the following Friday. Doyle, 65 years old, and wearing the particular confidence of a man who has always been certain he's right, and his wife Glenda in a cream blazer in July heat, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of visit this would be. They brought flowers and a bottle of wine and a manila folder that Doyle set on the hall table and didn't mention right away. Glenda walked through my house, the way people walk through houses they're pricing, pausing at the fireplace, glancing up at the ceiling, running her fingers along the kitchen island in a way she probably thought looked casual. I watched her without letting her see me watch. Hugh had picked that island out himself, drove to Savannah for it, carried it up the front steps with 2 neighbors, and his back complaining for a week. It was not something to run your fingers along like it was already someone else's. "I'd forgotten how spacious this place is," Glenda said, smiling at me with all her teeth. "Hugh designed it," I said. "He liked room to breathe." She said it like an appraisal. We had dinner. We talked around the edges of the thing they'd come to discuss. And I let them, because I was still in that mode of myself where I smoothed things over before I fully understood what I was smoothing. It wasn't until Doyle, over his second glass of wine, said the words "once we get things consolidated" that I felt the first cold click of recognition in the back of my mind. "Consolidated," I said. "What does that mean exactly?" Doyle leaned forward. "The shop property, the house, the Church Street lot. It makes more sense held under a single management structure. Something Glenda and I can oversee, at least until you've had time to properly grieve. Hugh would have wanted family handling this, not strangers collecting fees." I looked at my brother across the dinner table and thought, "You have been planning the words for this conversation for weeks." "I'll think about it," I said. After dinner, Glenda offered to help with the dishes. I said I had it. She smiled and went to make phone calls from the guest room with the door shut, and through the wall I could hear her voice, low and even, and I could not make out the words. I lay awake that night thinking about something Hugh had said to me the spring before he got sick. We'd been in this bedroom, him reading, me pretending to, and he'd put down his glasses and looked at me in that careful way he had when he was saying something he'd been holding for a while. If anything ever happens to me, he'd said, "Don't let anyone rush you. Don't sign anything until Sabrina's had a chance to look at it." I'd told him to stop talking like that. He'd said, "I mean it." And then he'd picked up his book again and never brought it up. And I had filed it under the category of things careful men say when they're being thorough, and hadn't thought about it again until now, lying in the dark listening to Glenda's muffled voice through the wall. The next morning I found her in Hugh's study. She was standing at his filing cabinet, closed, with her hand resting on top of it in a way that looked like she'd just finished doing something, and was composing herself before I walked in. She turned and gave me a smile that didn't travel all the way up to her eyes. "Looking for a pen," she said. The pens were on Hugh's desk, 6 feet away, in a cup that said "World's Okayest Engineer" that our daughter had given him as a joke. "Of course," I said. I made coffee and sat with it at the kitchen table, and did not think about what I'd seen for approximately 40 minutes, which was how long I needed before I could think clearly about it. Doyle sat me down after breakfast with the folder. "Just a management arrangement," he said. "Limited power of attorney over the estate and the business interests. Tax purposes, mostly. You'd still be involved in everything. This just gives me the legal standing to act on your behalf when you don't want to deal with the paperwork." I looked at my brother and tried to find the boy I'd grown up with, the one who walked me to school when the older kids bothered me, who'd carried my suitcase to the college dormitory and cried at my wedding, even though he'd pretended he had something in his eye. He was still in there somewhere, but he was currently buried under a folder of legal documents and a wife who had ambitions he'd been unable to meet on his own. "I'll need time to think," I said. That afternoon, while Doyle napped and Glenda made more phone calls, I went to Hugh's study and did what he'd told me to do the first time something felt wrong. I opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, the one with the small brass lock he'd had since before I met him, and I used the key that had lived on my keychain for 11 years, without me ever knowing what it opened. Inside was a document I had never seen. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough: my name, the phrase irrevocable trust, our daughter's name listed as executor, and I understood, on the third page, a clause that I read twice and then a third time. Any party who initiates legal proceedings against the primary beneficiary, or who exerts undue influence, financial pressure, or fraudulent representation toward the primary beneficiary within 36 months following the grantor's death, shall forfeit all secondary rights, claims, and interests in this estate. Hugh had built a trap. He'd constructed it before he got sick, filed it quietly with an attorney I didn't know he'd retained, and said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining who, exactly, he'd built it for. I called my daughter from my car, parked in the driveway with the engine off, so there was no chance of being overheard. She answered on the second ring. Sabrina. 34 years old, living in Portland, working as a contracts attorney for a tech firm. We talked every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesdays when one of us needed the other. "Mom," she heard it in my voice before I said a word. "Your uncle is here," I said, "and I found something in your father's files." There was a pause, not a confused pause, a knowing one. "Dad called me," she said, 4 months before he died. "He told me Uncle Doyle would come eventually. Not maybe, eventually. He said when he does, I need you to be ready. I've had the trust documents since February, Mom. I've been waiting." My hand pressed against my mouth. "He knew," I managed. "He said Uncle Doyle had always carried a resentment he couldn't name out loud, that Doyle felt left behind, that every time he looked at this house or the shop, he saw a reminder of what he'd borrowed and never repaid, and what he'd never managed to build on his own." She paused. "Dad wasn't angry about it. He said he understood it. He just didn't want you to be the one who paid for it." I sat in my car for a long time after we hung up. The magnolias in the front yard were blooming, fat white flowers that smelled like every good Sunday morning I'd ever had. Hugh planted those trees the year we moved in. I'd always thought he'd done it for the beauty of them. Now I thought maybe he'd done it knowing that one day I'd need something of his still living in the yard, still growing even after he was gone. I told my daughter to come home. She booked a red-eye that night. Doyle and Glenda didn't know Sabrina was coming. I didn't tell them. I made dinner, was pleasant, let Glenda talk about interest rates and what the market was doing. And honestly, sitting on this much property alone at your age doesn't make financial sense, does it? And I said, and passed the biscuits and thought about Hugh humming in the kitchen. My daughter arrived Saturday morning, 7 a.m., rolling a carry-on up my porch steps like she'd never left. She looked like her father, the same set to her jaw, the same directness in her eyes that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and was actually just clarity. She hugged me in the doorway and I held on longer than I meant to. "Stay in there," she said quietly. Still sleeping. Good. She set her bag down. "Let me get coffee first." By 9 o'clock, we were all in the living room. Doyle had brought the folder out. He'd also, overnight, arranged for someone else to be present, a man in his late 50s who shook my hand and explained he was there to facilitate a simple conversation. He had a leather briefcase and the careful eyes of someone paid to be in the room when things go sideways. Doyle said, "Now that Sabrina's here, even better. Family should be involved in these decisions." He smiled at his niece. My daughter did not smile back. "Whose attorney are you?" she asked the man with the briefcase. He said he represented the family's shared interests. "Which family?" Sabrina said. "Because I'm the executor of my father's estate, and if you were retained by the estate, I'd know about it. Which means you were retained by my uncle, which means you represent his interests, not my mother's." She looked at Doyle steadily. "So let's be clear about that before we go any further." I watched Doyle's expression shift. He'd always underestimated Sabrina, the way men of his generation underestimated young women in professional clothes, looking for softness and running into a wall instead. Glenda leaned forward with the particular warmth people deploy when they are not being warm at all. "Sweetheart, we just want what's best for your mother. This arrangement would actually protect her." "Then you'll be relieved by what my father already arranged," Sabrina said, and opened her own folder. She placed Hugh's trust documents on the coffee table. Then, beside them, a second set of papers I hadn't seen before. "These are communications between my uncle and a development company called Hargrove Properties, going back 14 months. She tapped the stack. 14 months ago, my father was still alive, and my uncle was already discussing what the Church Street parcel and the Honeycomb location might yield on the open market. The color left Doyle's face like water draining from a tub. "Those are private," he started. "They were subpoenaed," Sabrina said, "when I retained my own attorney 6 weeks ago on my father's instruction." The room went very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the magnolias, a bird was singing, ridiculously peaceful. "You hired an attorney 6 weeks ago," I said. She looked at me. "Dad set aside money for it. It's all documented." I watched Glenda's attorney close his briefcase, slowly but closing it. Sabrina turned to him. "You should also know that on Friday morning, your client's wife accessed the estate's private filing cabinet without authorization. We have the digital lock log. My father had the electronic mechanism installed 3 years ago, and the timestamp records are stored off-site." She said it the way she might mention the weather. "That constitutes unauthorized access to protected estate documents. I have photographs of the cabinet's current state versus its documented state from the last inspection. And there are discrepancies." Glenda made a sound that wasn't a word. "And one more thing," Sabrina said, now looking directly at Doyle. "Dad knew about the loan. $40,000, 2009. There was a promissory note. Yes, he kept it. He kept everything. And that outstanding debt is specifically referenced in the trust as a prior unresolved financial obligation. Combined with any further attempt to exert pressure on this estate, it triggers the forfeiture clause. Automatically, no court required." Doyle sat back. And what I hadn't expected, what I'll think about for the rest of my life, was that he didn't argue. He just sat there, 65 years old, and the folder in his lap suddenly looked small, and I could see underneath all of it, underneath the scheme and the lawyer and the 14 months of planning, I could see my brother, the one who'd been left behind, the one who'd watched his younger sister build something beautiful with a man who loved her, and who had carried the weight of that for 30 years without ever finding the right words for what it had cost him. I wasn't glad. I want that understood. There was nothing satisfying about it. The attorney stood up and said his clients needed a moment to reconsider, and took himself into the hallway. Glenda looked at Doyle. He was staring at the floor. "I think it's time to go," I said, not angry, just done. Glenda started in about misunderstandings, about things getting out of hand, about how they'd only ever wanted to help. Sabrina looked at her without speaking, and whatever Glenda saw in that look stopped the words mid-sentence. They were gone by noon. 3 cars in my driveway, then 2, then 1, my daughter's rental, and then the house was quiet again, differently quiet, like something had moved through and left the air cleaner. Sabrina and I sat on the porch with our tea and didn't speak for a long time. "Did he tell you everything?" I asked finally. "About what he expected might happen?" "Not at first. Toward the end, more." She set her glass on the rail. "He said the shop wasn't just a business to him. He said it was proof that you and he had done something real together, something that lasted. He didn't want anyone turning it into a transaction." She paused. "He also said you'd feel bad about how it ended with Uncle Doyle. He said, 'Tell your mother it's not her job to fix a man who had 30 years to fix himself.'" I laughed at that, sharp and sudden. The way laughter comes back when you'd forgotten what it felt like a light turned on in a room you'd stopped expecting to use. Doyle called 3 weeks later. Just him, no Glenda. I could tell by the way he spoke that whatever they were to each other had shifted, was still shifting, in ways I probably wouldn't hear the full account of. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've been sorry for longer than just this, sis. I want you to know that." I waited. "I told myself it was about protecting you." That was easier to say than the truth. He was quiet a moment. "The truth is, I looked at what you and Hugh built, and I couldn't stand that I'd never built anything close to it. And that's my failure, not yours. It was always my failure." "You borrowed money from us," I said, "and you never said a word about it." "I know." "Hugh never once brought it up to you. Not once in 31 years. "No," he said, "he wouldn't." A long pause. "Hugh was a better man than I deserved to have in my life. I knew that. I just couldn't bring myself to act like I knew it." I didn't tell him we were fine. That would have been a lie I wasn't ready to wear. But I didn't hang up either. I told him I'd be in touch, and I meant it, and I think he understood what that meant coming from me. Not forgiveness yet, but a door left partially open. The rest would depend on what he did with the space. Honeycomb Pies is still on King Street. The yellow awning got repainted in September. My daughter arranged it while I was pretending not to notice she'd arranged it. Sabrina comes down from Portland more often than twice a month now, and she's looking at apartments near the Elliottboro neighborhood, which is 2 miles from the shop, which I know because she showed me the listings and asked what I thought. I told her what I thought. She's signing a lease in the fall. We hired a young woman from James Island who makes the butter crusts better than I do, and the only person I've admitted that to is you. Her grandmother used to come in every Saturday for the coconut cream. Things circle back in ways you don't see coming, and most of the times that's the best part. Hugh's study is mostly as he left it. I work in there on Tuesday afternoons now, ordering invoices, accounts, the small paperwork of a life continuing. I look up sometimes at the framed photograph on the wall, the 2 of us at our 20th anniversary, laughing at something I can't recall anymore. That's all right. Some things you keep in the body rather than the memory. I kept that laugh somewhere. I can still feel it. He knew, I think, earlier than I've wanted to admit, that things would get complicated once he was gone. He'd seen the shape of it from further away than I could. So he'd done what he always did with things that needed doing. He handled it quietly, completely, without making a production of it, and left me the instructions only when I was ready to find them. A key on a keychain for 11 years, a drawer I didn't know I was waiting to open. Some kinds of love are loud. They're the ones you see coming, the ones that get told and retold. And some kinds of love are like a trust document filed with the probate court, sitting in a locked drawer in a study that still smells like the man who built it. Quiet, legal, binding, patient. The kind that waits for you to need it before it shows itself. I have both kinds now, just arranged differently than I expected, just given to me in ways I hadn't known to look for. The magnolias are blooming again this summer. I sit on the porch in the evenings, after the shop closes. And I look at those trees and I think about a man who planted them, knowing he wouldn't always be here to see them, and who arranged everything he could so that the woman he loved would still be standing in this yard, on this porch, with her sweet tea and her daughter and her life still fully hers, long after he was gone. That's what he gave me. That's what I intend to keep.